This old guy needs very clear direction.
Go ahead, Scott.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name is Scott Wolf. I'm Executive Director of Grossmart, Rhode Island. And I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the sixth panel discussion in our online Power of Place Summit series. Today we are focusing on grassroots community engagement as the best path to effective, inclusive redevelopment. I want to begin by thanking Dwayne Keys, the dynamic and insightful leader of the South Providence Neighborhood Association, for organizing today's webinar and recruiting a stellar lineup of panelists who you'll be hearing about and from very shortly. Before turning things over to Dwayne, I'd like to make some brief observations about why we at Grossmart, Rhode Island, think that this webinar is especially important and timely, and then review the format and logistics for today's discussion. Clearly, over the last month, there's been a real reawakening, hopefully among many people in Rhode Island and in the nation, about tackling the scourge of systemic racism, as well as confronting the unacceptable and counterproductive economic, health, and criminal justice disparities, among others, between whites and minority, the minority community. Grossmart, Rhode Island is wrestling with this, is trying to be a better change agent in these areas, and is looking forward to learning from Dwayne and the panelists about how we can do a better job. We have asserted for many years that growth can only be smart if it benefits the many, not just the few. Translating that lofty principle into reality is sometimes challenging and complicated. There's a lot of competing interests and occasional unintended consequences associated with neighborhood revitalization. There's sometimes developers don't take community needs into account, don't take the time and the trouble to engage the community at the beginning of the development process. Sometimes community members assume that all developers are evil, and which we don't think is the case. So there's a lot to unpack. There's some baggage we all bring to this, and I think it's critical that we have discussions like this to try to overcome that baggage and have results when it comes to redevelopment that benefit the many and not just the few. In a statement that we issued several weeks ago in the aftermath of the brutal murder of George Floyd and other African Americans, we noted the following. While eliminating police brutality and overt racism must be our immediate collective objectives, there's much more to be done long-term, as we see it anyway, to make Rhode Island a lively, fair, and successful experiment for all. We must, for example, expand affordable housing and transit choices, make it easier for minority-owned businesses to get off the ground and flourish, especially in our downtowns and main streets, and to transform our urban neighborhoods into much healthier places by aggressively promoting brownfield cleanup and creative redesign of our streets to ensure more access to safe walking, biking, jogging, and other forms of recreation. So having given you a little bit of a sense of how we're thinking about some of these critical issues, I want to shift to reviewing just a little bit of information about logistics and format for today. And actually, I want to talk about the future first before we get back to the present. We're going to have discussions on different topics in our webinar series every Wednesday morning through late September. So I would encourage people who enjoyed today's session to check out subsequent ones. The webinars are going to culminate on September 25th with a half-day virtual plenary session featuring Scott Spencer of Smart Growth America and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, along with award-winning columnist E.J. Dion of the Washington Post and the Brookings Institution. Next, I want to thank our sponsors. And as you'll see on the screen here, we've got 65 sponsors from our region. We're very proud of that and proud of them for stepping up to the plate. It's a diverse group as well as a large group. They represent fields fields ranging from business and development and historic preservation and housing and community revitalization to finance and transportation and higher education. I encourage all of you participating today to thank these organizations and the people you know working for them when you see them, and to patronize their services. The panelists today are terrific people with great backgrounds, and their full bios are included in the summit page of our website. For those of you who are interested in professional credit for participating in today's session, this and other webinars in our series are approved for one AICP CM credit. I think those of you who want to take advantage of that know what that means. Others of you are scratching your head, but that's okay. You can log those credits on the American Planning Association website, I believe. There's going to be a question and answer dialogue at the end of the panel, and please use the Q&A function in Zoom to type in your questions. Finally, the session's being recorded, and everybody today who's observing it will have access to a recording of it if we do our job right within several days. So those are some of the preliminaries. Dwayne, thanks for your patience, and now the floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so very much, Scott, and thank you all who are on the call today with attending today's session, as we've entitled Emphasizing Grassroots Community Engagement, the Best Path for Redevelopment. With me, we do have other panelists, Gloria Johnson with West Elmwood Development Corporation. Give her a chance to say hello to everyone.
Morning, everyone.
Good. We have Marta Martinez with Rhode Island Latino Arts.
Buenos dias, good morning.
We have Paula Donovan with the Elmwood Neighborhood Association.
Hi, everybody.
Great, great. And we also have Raymond Watson with the Providence Cultural Equity Initiative. I believe he had some technical difficulties, so he's trying to sign on right now to another outlet. So while we're basically waiting for him to join back, we can get started a little bit with talking about how we came to this particular session. The South Providence Neighborhood Association, we've had obviously a number of experiences with development in our own area, everything from demolishing buildings, building up buildings. There's been questions about how we, what does community engagement look like? Like, how do you go about it? What are the best ways to do it? And so that has been extremely, we've gone through a process where we've had a lot of learnings, and I've had some successes with how to do community development when it comes to historically excluded groups, in particular Black, Indigenous, and people of color, low to moderate income. And with that particular scenario, we wanted to have an opportunity to share not only our findings, but speak with other folks who have had these conversations. And so when it comes to Paula, Marta, Gloria, and Raymond, we have had these conversations amongst ourselves and in one-offs with other particular developers when a situation occurs. And so we wanted to have this opportunity to share, okay, taking those learnings all together, how do we go about with having what we want to say a robust community engagement that can be done not just only with communities of color or historically excluded groups, with any community. And I see Raymond has gotten back on with us. So thank you so very much, Raymond. You can say hello to everyone.
Greetings, everyone. Apologies, a little technical difficulties on this side, but Ray Watson, CEO and founder of the Providence Cultural Equity Initiative, and excited to be here for participating in this discussion this morning.
Great, great. Thank you so very much. So what we're going to do is that we have two particular questions we're going to ask. One, in order to move forward with robust community engagement, you have to first understand why that's happening. There's history, there's context behind why, when those situations happen with communities of color of opposition to development of any kind, there's reasons behind it. And so I think we need to make sure that we explain that to give that historical context. So each of our panelists is going to have some time to answer that particular question. We're then going to go into another question of asking, like, when we hear about robust community engagement, what does that look like in terms of some strategies? Our panelists are going to answer that question. We do then have a couple of ideas in terms of some strategies for community engagement that I'm going to ask each of our panelists to kind of weigh in on, give their response, their feelings, their thinking about this. We will allow for questions. Yes, as Scott noted, please use the Q&A option for the questions. We will use the chat box if there's a resource or some information that we want to share with you as we're having the discussion. So we want to keep that chat box open for that, but the question and the answers that will help us track your questions. If we can't get to all of your questions, we will, after the session's over, follow up with answering those questions in writing to you. And then we'll conclude the session within, hopefully, within the hour. So with further ado, I actually want to now just go into the first question. And in the order, I'm going to ask Gloria, then Marta, then Paula, then Raymond to answer or follow up. Start off with the first question, what we said, when we're having development or issues or some sort of proposed project, whether it's housing, transportation, there is a response of opposition, of fear, of concern. No one asked me why that happened. And so the question we want to share with our audience is why? What is that has gone on in prior years, prior decades, that is contributing that to the situation today? And so I want to start off with Gloria, if you can just take a few minutes to really tell from your perspective why that tends to occur.
For me, good morning again, everyone. I think it has a lot to do, in my personal opinion, with redlining and how redlining started. It was what happened almost a century ago. Basically, an organization would use a red marker and draw lines around communities that were to be excluded from lending, home ownership, and that sort of thing. And when you don't have one of the biggest wealth builders, which is home ownership, that leads to other things that are lacking in the community, better schools, access to capital for a business. So these communities are lacking all the things that you say you need, right? And for many folks, that trauma, because it is a trauma, has been passed down for generations and generations. I mean, even my mother's 83, and she talks about, growing up in South Providence and how these things happened, and she's still alive, so it wasn't that long ago. So I think that is one of the reasons. So people give developers and city planners and lenders kind of the side eye because of these exclusionary tactics that some would argue are still happening today.
Thank you so very much. I'm glad you brought up the redlining, because that was also the same justification for residential segregation, eminent domain, taking people's properties. When we think about the I-195 land, we have to remember that was once historically Black, as well as where 95 goes behind the mall. And that was used to seize land, take property, which was all planning. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Marta, thank you so much, Gloria. Marta, I know you have similar experiences that you've seen with communities of color, particularly the Latino community, of why those responses happen.
Yeah, very similar. In my case, with the Latino community, which makes up a large percentage of the residents on places like Broad Street and Elmwood and West End and all those urban places that are considered sometimes frightening for folks who drive through there. It's not frightening when developers and well-intended city planners make plans to change up the streetscape, for example. And in my experience, again, it's fear from the community when developers come in based on the past where there was an effort to reach out to the neighbors, but it was done with not taking into account the language barriers. The Latino, much of the change, the urban change that has happened in Providence was in the 70s or late 60s and 70s. And that's about the time that the Latino population really started to explode. It was in the late 70s that the first wave of the Dominican community came, and then others came. And with them came the language barrier. And so a lot of those changes that have been made were not taking that into account. And even today, when efforts are made, people feel like they're more open-minded, and efforts are made. And in fact, people reach out to me to see how they can translate or maybe hire people who speak Spanish to do some of the outreach. It seems to be a one-off situation where it's done. Maybe we have one meeting, a follow-up, a second follow-up, and a third, and then it's over. It's almost like they check the box and move on and say, oh, well, we spoke with them, and now we can do the work. And so that's been my experience.
Great, thank you so very much. I'm glad that you brought up the language barrier, Marta, and you gave that history about the late 60s, early 70s, because that was really the onset of urban renewal as we have heard about it. And so to think of someone who doesn't even speak the language in English and probably got a notification, doesn't know what it is, they have no clue that what was happening. And so it's also indicative of when you talk about cultural humility, speaking in the language that one understands. Well, obviously we weren't, and some would argue to a degree today, we still aren't doing that. So thank you. Now, it's interesting because, even in this COVID-19 era, you would think that, okay, with folks social distancing, we had to put a pause on work, we had to put a pause on everything. We wouldn't be enduring these experiences right now because everything should be on pause, we really should move forward. And yet, in the last 3 to 4 months, we have had some current situations where an announcement was made, a proposal was submitted, something was done, and there has been confusion and uproar within the community, particularly historical Black, Indigenous, and people of color, predominantly neighborhoods. Paula, in Elmwood, there were not one but 2 recent incidents that have occurred that have really created this kind of fear and really sensitivity to this issue. Could you speak more about that?
Sure. So there was a proposal made for the redevelopment of a church on Adelaide Avenue. And there are, when it comes to community engagement, it feels that is, as Marta was inferring, it's more like a check the box issue instead of really understanding the demographics of our community. So on the one hand, this church has a historical element to it. And, you can look at it and say, it's been empty for a long time. And at last, somebody is going to step up and redevelop it. But there are concerns with the impact on the immediate surrounding area in terms of density and traffic. The developer, we had a zoning board hearing, and there were a number of people from the neighborhood who spoke at that hearing, and people who submitted letters. Some people are in favor, some people are against it. But I think also to Marta's point, in this particular part of the South Side, our population is 46% Latino. None of the notifications have been sent out in Spanish. And I don't live very far from that church. And I know that there are Latino residents nearby. Now, the other piece of it is that some of those properties, abutting properties, the owners may not live in the neighborhood. They are the ones who are getting the notifications, not the people who actually live next to the church. So that is problematic. And in my work with the neighborhood association, I try to reach out to the people who actually live there and say, please, we want you to participate in this process. And I would say too that, so, I looked at the plans of the development, and, to the point of the developer not understanding the demographics of the neighborhood, the visuals of the plan only show white people. And that is, that was very telling to me, and it was very telling to some other people. The other piece, that the second issue that you referred to, Dwayne, was the removal of the Columbus statue on Elmwood Avenue. And I think that there was a lot of pressure put on the city government to remove that statue. But there was no recognition that people who live in the area have been working on revitalizing that park overall, and also doing more educational workshops around that statue, the history of that statue, the history of Columbus, and the history of Gorham Manufacturing that created that statue, which was purchased. It was owned by the Elmwood Neighborhood Group at that time, and they donated it for that park. So the fact that it was removed without any acknowledgement of what people are trying to do around that statue and what people in the community have been doing, to me personally, felt, how do I say, I felt like it was more of a political expedient action than community-based action.
Thank you so very much, Paula, for providing that insight in this COVID-19 era, that even still then, with the social distancing and things being slowed down, we're still experiencing these issues. And turning to Raymond, you also, being the former executive director of the Mount Hope Neighborhood Association, there was another incident that happened sometime earlier, which again came from the city, which was supposed to be a benefit, and yet there was a response from the Mount Hope neighborhood that what made people be taken back and surprised. Can you share more about that experience?
Sure, absolutely, Dwayne. So just for a little bit of background on myself, I come from a planning professional background. I graduated in 2005 from URI's planning school. And there, one of my main mentors was a woman by the name of Marcia Marker Feld. And if people are familiar with the planning profession, then they know that Professor Feld was individual who was adamant that whenever you're planning, the first thing you always keep in mind is, who is your client? Who is your audience? Who are you doing this for? And when you examine planning from that perspective, then of course, logically, the first thing you do is go and engage with your client to see what their interests are, to see if what you have in mind matches up with what they have in mind. And then you take that feedback that they give you and you apply it in a manner so that whatever your product is, whatever your service is, they're bought into it from the very beginning. What Dwayne is referring to is the city's Slow Streets program, that where they pretty much just decided which streets they were going to close down based upon their perception of what was beneficial for the community. And my biggest issue is this: from a planning perspective and from a professionalism perspective, it's absolutely the wrong attitude and wrong strategy to just go and do something for a community without engaging with them, because at the very least, you're going to get bad publicity from it. And that's pretty much what happened with that situation. If anyone knows the Mount Hope Neighborhood Association, now the Mount Hope Community Center, it's a history of being an advocate for the community over there, which has been marginalized, which has been racialized, which has been all sorts of things going on with it. And then when you talk about history, if anyone's familiar with the history of the University Heights complex, that was all during urban renewal, and that was the government coming in saying, we know what's best for you, we're gonna do this for you, and it'll be better for you in the end. And in the end, it wasn't. So what we saw with the Slow Streets program was just a continuation of that mentality and that strategy of, we know what's best for you. And we weren't going to accept that. And I think that that's the space that planners in general and government in general need to understand, especially as we see what's going on in contemporary society. The community as a whole isn't going for that anymore. So you can either engage up front and have a very robust process where you take the time and actually listen and apply what you hear, or you can rush it through and have community members out protesting and bad press and having the mayor looking bad, because that was my thing. I said, everyone's blaming the mayor, but I don't blame the mayor for this. There are professionals called planners who are supposed to have their ears and eyes to this and give him the heads up before it gets here. And that wasn't what we saw in Slow Street. So you had a very passionate response from the neighborhood association up to us, calling the mayor and letting him know, we'll be removing the barriers for you. You don't even need to send out your city workers. We've got it. The community is going to help you out. So those are my thoughts in that regard, Dwayne.
Thank you so very much. And actually, I just saw a question or a statement in the chat. I'm just going to read this. Hi, everyone. Please not let this conversation go on when addressing how overwhelmed city staff and community nonprofits are. I'm glad that this came up. Like, true engagement is time consuming. It takes people. And when there's not enough funding, not enough hiring people, it's hard to just get by each day. We're actually going to get to that in question number 2. When we talk about robust community engagement. So I'm glad you started off there, because sometimes with limited budgets, and we're actually going to share an experience that the South Providence Neighborhood Association, which is a volunteer, all volunteer nonprofit, had done, which also at the end of this conversation, we're going to share an example of a successful community engagement. So thank you so very much in terms of that, with ideas, in terms of increasing funding. Perhaps it's not increasing funding, maybe it's how we plan and do such times. We're going to get into that question right now. Thank you so very much. One of the things that I do want to follow up, which is summarizing that first question, it really kind of goes along with, if I can kind of just some touch points, like the existing residents need to be top priority in any plans that are going to go on. You need to be thinking about them first and foremost. I think some of you have already said, how does this benefit them? What will they gain by it? Is this what they need or want? I think another point, and just some basic stuff in terms of ask, don't assume. Rather than assuming that, let's say that Gloria said the best, recognizing that trauma that has happened. So you have a community that is automatically on edge, is automatically on its feet. And particularly when we think of the racial strife that is already occurring, we need to be much more intentional of really taking our time with proceeding with this process. Marta, you also brought up some things of language barriers, but I want to kind of expand on that to be more, like you said, cultural humility. Not assuming how you need to go about with engaging with that community, but really understanding, doing your research. As someone who's a marketing major, you hear of market research. You need to know your audience. You need to know that for your product to sell. So if you want to be successful. But thank you so very much for those questions, because now we're going to go into the second question. Some of you had already touched on this, and that question and the statement in the chat box was already kind of addressed that. Well, when we hear about community engagement, well, we did talk to a few people. We talked to so-and-so who's 5 or 6 blocks down the street, or we talked to this one person that is a prominent community leader, or, we really didn't have the time or the funding. We just don't have that capacity. And, but we have to hurry up and get this project done. So we really are doing it, but there's only so much that we can do. So, I always then would come back with what is your definition of robust community engagement? When you hear of those 3 words coming together, what does that mean to you? Like, how did you go about it? What did you think was adequate or sufficient? And I definitely want to take another set of time with each of you. We're going to start with Raymond and kind of doing reverse. When you hear those 3 words, what does that look like? What does that feel like? What should, steps or actions or how should it be executed in a way that will achieve the inclusion that we want to desire, but also meets capacity issues that were noted with that statement in the chat box?
Sure. So I think the first word I would apply to it is it has to be comprehensive. To your point, Dwayne, oh, well, we spoke to this one prominent leader. Okay, who else did you speak to? The whole checking off the box thing, I think that's the problem, because they think, well, we spoke to someone from there and now they represent the voice of the entire community. I think if you're coming in with that mind state, you're already setting yourself up for failure. So it has to be comprehensive. You spoke to him. What I always encourage people is to ask that person who you spoke to, who else should we speak to? Who else do you think would be valuable for us to get their input on? and you'll quickly find a number of people that you can speak to. You might even get overwhelmed. So I think it has to be comprehensive. I think it has to be intentional. I think, once again, you can't do it as a box check. You have to do it as a fundamental element of success for the project to make sure that the outcome puts everyone in the best position. I don't think developers are all bad. I think they do themselves a great disservice by not understanding who their clientele is or who their market is. And those are basic business shortfalls that are causing what's happening. So it has nothing to do with the community. It's that you're not even applying what you were trained to do with this community. And I think that brings me to my last point. It has to be of value. You have to value that. You have to see the benefit in doing that, not do it like it's something you have to do, because if you don't, then you can't move forward with this government contract you're trying to get. You value that community. You value this project that you're bringing in there. You want this community to value the project as closely as you do. So be comprehensive, be intentional, and value their time, their energy, their feedback. Strategize your engagement with them like they're important. And if you start with that mind frame, you're going to be in a much better space, whatever you're trying to do for a community in terms of an overall successful outcome.
Thank you so very much, Raymond. Paula, just turning to you. You did kind of note that with the prior question, but if you kind of elaborate more with, what does that look like to you in terms of best practices?
Sure. So for me, and I've participated in, various presentations, at city commissions and boards. And what I find is problematic is by the time the community becomes aware of a project, it's already been approved by the Department of Planning and Development or maybe the Historic District Commission. And the community notification is a 200-foot radius, which is a kind of a small radius. The amount of notification for hearings on particular properties is often short. So by the time the community gets involved, I feel like it's an uphill battle. We have to fight against the Department of Planning and Development's recommendations or the Historic District Commission's recommendations. I had an experience on my own street with a piece of property that's residential that wants to be changed to commercial. And looking at the recommendation from the Department of Planning and Development, they had an incorrect picture of the property, but also too, they referenced that it fit within the comprehensive plan for the city and that it fit into the character of the neighborhood. And my concern for a lot of people is the encroachment of commercial properties into the residential areas, which would increase density, cause more traffic problems. I think the other piece of it too is community engagement issues are, you've got developers who have a cadre of lawyers and consulting professionals and accountants. Oftentimes neighborhood input is all volunteer based. So it can be, it's sometimes difficult for us to catch up and make our arguments either for or against a project. So those are concerns around community engagement from my perspective.
Thank you so very much, Paula. Marta, thinking about reflecting what else was said, is there anything that you're finding that's missing, particularly when it comes to those who may not even, when English is not their first language?
I'd like to just kind of add to some of I wrote some words down as I was listening. So Raymond used the word we need to value, and I would like to add to that respect the neighborhood. So that's really what that means. And by respecting the neighborhood, I mean, I'm reading some of the chat and questions that are coming up. And I think the most important thing that we're missing is, I mean, sometimes there's money and there's no time to implement what that money, the grants you get a grant, you have a deadline. You have to kind of move fast. And I've been on that end of it where you have to move fast. And then you're also in the community, and by the time the word gets to you that the process has moved forward, it's only because they've got that deadline. I think my best experience has been is to find people in the community, neighborhood associations. That's another group that we've been referencing. And Dwayne, I know you run one, and I run one too in my neighborhood, and we're all volunteers. And that's because we care about the neighborhood. We live there. We really want to make sure that the change happens and that it happens in the right way. But what's missing is funding for these neighborhood associations and finding people. I mean, I use the word trusted voices, so that the people in the neighborhood are your trusted voices. And so give opportunity, make contacts within those neighborhood associations, not just when the money is there, not when the need is there, but always, always, always. Make sure that there's people, boots on the ground, you're always out there. That's kind of how I work. I just spend a lot of time on Broad Street. I don't live there. I don't live in Providence, but I spend a lot of time there. There's a new restaurant, I'll go check it out. I just go, I hear there's a building going down, I just kind of look. There's a new one coming up, I kind of look. People know me, they think I live there. And I like to think that I become a trusted voice, and I think that we need to do more of that. And when I do projects, and that primarily focus on places like Broad Street, and if I can even go into Central Falls and Dexter Street, Broad Street, the West End, I go to the neighborhood myself, and I spend, I would say, a year just getting to the neighborhood. I eat there, I shop there, and I don't just engage with the Latino community, I engage with everyone. Because the neighborhood for me, I mean, I am a Latina and I do work, and because I'm bilingual, I tend to get more involved with that, but I just really want to respect who lives there and get them all engaged in these neighborhood groups and in knowing. And so when I do see that there's going to be a hearing, at that point, I know that I can come back and bring together those people quickly, because you know, they've been developed as trusted voices, and I have the mechanisms to move them to get some reaction quickly. It's difficult. It's difficult for government to come in and make the change, and it's good change. I'm not saying that some of the proposed projects in all of our neighborhoods I'm not against them. It's just a matter of the timing and that we have, because we have the funds.
Great. Gloria, just hearing what has been said with our panelists so far, is there anything that hasn't been said with regards to like robust community engagement? What does that mean and look like to you?
Right, I agree with everything all the previous panelists spoke about. For me, and I was thinking about this last night, and in my opinion, I always feel that, because we've seen it, and me and Dwayne, we've had many conversations about this, about projects being developed, and I think some of the panelists spoke about this, being developed, plans approved, the whole 9 yards, and then the community is the last person, the last people to find out that this thing is happening. I personally find that exceptionally disrespectful to the residents of the community. And as Ray spoke about previously, it's about valuing your client. Your client is that community. It will not hurt you just to spend some time, as Marta talked about, in that community, whether it's just walking around, getting to know people, going to the local coffee shop, spending some time at the park, talking to parents, not just community leaders, spending that time. And unfortunately, a lot of developers and city planners, they don't do this. And even if the project's a really great idea, they're going to get a ton of pushback because the residents feel disrespected because of the lack of communication and the lack of input from them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so very much. Thank you all. I think that Raymond, we may have lost him. He should be trying to dial back in. Actually, kind of wrap up the second question, because we just had a question. Can you speak of a time in recent history, if any, where a development project was a success and that people value voices, and actually not only simply heard those voices, but listened and acted upon those voices in the community? Also, you know, thank you for the webinar. So I just put in the chat box the Barbara Jordan 2 community engagement and the link to that. that I want to say is a prime success that the South Providence Neighborhood Association, other community groups, I know each of you were, through Neighbors Revitalization, West Elmwood, were participants in that engagement. Yes, there were funds for that community engagement, but what I want to say is someone who was on the steering committee for that particular group, one, there was an allocation of time. So we heard this, how do we increase funding? Well, it wasn't an issue of funding. It was an issue of, do we rush this? Or do we take the time to provide the space, to give the input, to collect that information, to collect that feedback, to collect that data? I want to say that even before Rhode Island Housing did their own community engagement, you had DARE, Neighbors for Revitalization, Info-R, and SBNA who were doing their own engagement. So when one particular question we may answer is, well, how do we get such feedback or information if we can't meet face-to-face? Well, if you have an email list, then that means you can also solicit. So we also had a survey that we asked folks to complete. We arranged for it to be done in paper, but we also had an online survey in which people could complete anonymously. Another way in which, if some folks don't want to be on the spot, maybe there's fear of interrogation, fear of they're going to have some kind of, some response that they were able to give that information anonymously. And so we were able to collect that feedback, compile it, it was shared with them. So even before that formal community engagement process was done, we had already started talking with folks and collecting that. But a huge part, again, being a volunteer organization, was we allow time. And I think that maybe that's one scenario in looking at your planning is, if you want to have successful, perhaps you need to incorporate time to do it. And so that is a matter of fact, and not just looking at, oh, we don't have the funds, oh, we don't have to do that. You don't have to stress yourself out with doing this work. You need to give yourself more time to be able to do it. I actually want to just now move on to the third section, because thinking about that and that community engagement, there were some elements that I want to just get your feedback on, and then we're going to move on to questions. So far, we do have 3 in the question and answer box, but just thinking of some particular ideas as to, what would be helpful in terms of strategies. One that we've heard of is co-creation. And that was one which was also kind of done with the Barbara Jordan 2, where you have residents along with other folks who are actually involved in the design process, how something's going to look, feel, reflect. Is it within the character of the neighborhood? But it's very intentional that they that this concept is really utilized for communities of color who, again, have been excluded from zoning and overall planning processes as a means of getting engaged. I just want to get like some initial reactions to the 4 of you, if you do have, of that particular concept. If you heard about it, what are you thinking? And any one of you can answer.
Personally, I think that's a really fantastic idea. I think yes, in theory, it sounds like a really great idea, having, neighborhood residents come to the table and help in the designing process. I just don't know how feasible it really is, because of, not many people understand the whole planning and that sort of thing. Not saying people couldn't learn, but I like the idea in theory. I'm just not sure how feasible it actually is.
So Dwayne, I had some experience with it in my capacity as ED at Mount Hope. At the time, Councilman Kevin Jackson was there, and he reached out to me one day. I had known Kevin since I was running track with him at like 7 or 8. And he said, Ray, we've got some money from the city to redo Billy Taylor Playground, but I don't just want to come in. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, very good. He said, I don't just want to come in and have the city just do something. I'd like to get the neighborhood involved. What can we do? So my response to Councilman Jackson was, well, why don't we go and connect with the Mount Hope Learning Center and Martin Luther King Elementary and work through the youth? And the youth will naturally bring their parents. So it was over 2 sessions. The first session, we came in and just presented to the youth there different options for what a playground could look like. And they gave their feedback. The city then compiled all of that feedback, came back a couple of months later and did a presentation to the youth, and we invited their parents to come out to the presentation as well on what they thought would be a good sort of structure for the playground. They got a little bit more feedback, but in general, the children were in support of it and the parents were supportive of it. Then we organized an actual neighborhood installation of the playground. So to Dwayne's point, we took time with it. We didn't rush it. We didn't try to just run it through. We took the time to actually engage. In my opinion, that's one of the nicest playgrounds in the city right now. And it's not really graffitied or destroyed at all because it was actual community members out there putting it in, who either were parents who were like, you know, don't mess that up. I was one of the people put it in there, or who were youth who have grown up saying, hey, I remember I had input on that. I remember I actually helped put that in there. I want to take care of it more. So I think, to Dwayne's point, being intentional about it, taking the time, allocating time for it. As I said from the very beginning, it's always going to be a better outcome. You're always going to get a better product. You're always going to get more engagement. You're going to save yourself from being embarrassed in the media or on social media. And you're instead going to get some really good press and some people talking highly about the work that you did.
Great, great. Thank you. Any other thoughts on that before I move on to the next idea?
Dwayne, it's Paula. I'm not as familiar with that concept, but it sounds very positive. I think that it gives the opportunity to give a more like holistic view about our neighborhoods and, you know, the properties that or the issues that need to be addressed, even things like, you know, getting our sidewalks fixed. You know, it may seem like a small thing, but it really does. It's a quality of life issue, especially if you're in a neighborhood, you know, in terms of handicap accessibility. If your sidewalks aren't in good shape, people can't get around. So I think having it as an ongoing process, not just, you know, a one-off charrette or meeting, but it has to be ongoing. And we need information about, okay, our Elmwood Community Center, what's happening with that? You know, what is happening with this church on Adelaide Avenue? You know, what is happening with the playground at Sackett Street School? All of those things that are important to the people who are raising families.
Thank you, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next idea, one in which was presented to the SBNA meeting back in November. It's called participatory budgeting, or PB. And it's a democratic process in which community members decide how to spend part of a public budget. And it really gives people real power over real money. It's something that started overseas and has been brought into the United States in different particular states, cities, counties, housing authorities, schools. Just to kind of explain how it works. And again, it's an annual cycle of engagement in which it follows the steps of designing the process. A steering committee that represents the community creates the rules and the engagement of the plan. How are we going to engage? Then they brainstorm ideas through meetings and online tools, or residents share and discuss ideas for projects. Then they develop proposals in which volunteer, like budget, they call it volunteer budget delegates, develop the ideas into actual feasible proposals, and then residents vote on the proposals that they most think they're going to serve the community's needs, and then you fund the winning projects, the government or the institution that funds and implements the winning ideas. So that's been something that was presented to the Neighbor Association. Our neighbors really took heart on to wanting to have something like that, and I just want to get your feedback on that idea.
I can think of two projects that I was involved in that kind of that went through that participatory, and they were successful until, well, I just wonder, they were successful up until the point where, so we had proposals, two proposals. One is to do some art on the bus shelters. And the second proposal is more recent, and it's to do something with the streets. And there was RFPs out, we apply. Now in the case of the bus shelters, it seemed to be it was a well-done process where they got proposals, they were reviewed, and then they were given funding. But then I think that's where it ended. The artists were given funds, and the artists really weren't what I think would have been made it more successful is for the artists to take the time to get to know the community, this whole discussion. So some of the artwork that went up on those shelters, the people didn't like it. And it wasn't a week or a month or several months later where it was destroyed or tagged because they felt that it just was inappropriate. And an example of that is one that was in front of the Southside Cultural Center, is where I had my office. It was totally destroyed. The community there, so you have the South Providence community, but that particular corner it's where the shelters are, the homeless shelter. So the community there there's a lot of homeless people who just kind of hang out there, and they were insulted by not only them, but there were other people, but they themselves did not like the bus shelter that was there. And it just seems that, I mean, it seems like it kind of stopped there. You need to kind of keep going deeper when you give the opportunity for these grants to be awarded. Somehow also guide folks and give them time to get to know the community before you do your artwork. That's just a personal example.
Great. Thank you so very much. I know we have pressing time, and I want to just get more time for answering the questions because we're approaching almost 11 o'clock. But I'm just going to read off some of the other ideas. We can do a quick just response. Another one was when you're talking about, outreach to participants, look at the demographics of those who are attending your meetings to actually collect racial and other demographic information to really get a better sense. Is your meeting or your gathering reflective of the community that you're trying to serve? That was one thing, is to really think about if you're seeing a meeting where a neighborhood is predominantly Black and brown, people of color, but yet the attendees are majority white. Is that really an inclusive or really gathering of the feedback from the neighborhood? Should you think about having more meetings and other strategies to outreach? Yes, Raymond.
I would even suggest removing ourselves from the mind state of, do I have the right demographic at my meeting? Are you going to other people's meetings?
Okay. Yep.
Stuff that's already going on. And this is what I mean about valuing people's time. If there are already orgs that hold meetings, why are you trying to create a new one to get people to come to convenience you? You should be taking the time to find out what opportunities for engagement are there, assessing your time and making sure you're able to be there, and that you touch base in advance to let whoever's hosting the meeting know that you'd like to be there and what their thoughts are about that. So this is what I mean about being comprehensive and intentional, not just, okay, we need to engage, we'll hold a meeting on this night, it seems to work for everyone, let's see who we can get the word out to. All right, we're on to the next thing. Well, we don't understand why people, no, value people. Inconvenience yourself when you're engaging, like you do for any other client. When you're going for your grant, you inconvenience yourself by having to take time to write it, having to look up the statistics and research. You inconvenience yourself. Continue to inconvenience yourself. Continue to take more of your time. Continue to take more of your energy, so that once again, you get the right input and engagement, so your outcome is better in the end.
Great.
And then when you get the grant, come back and stay engaged in the community with the money that you just got. Share it, give it to them.
Yeah, don't just take it off of them, use it with them. If you're gonna get money on behalf of the community, spend it with them.
Exactly, get their input. Like, there's no need to reinvent the wheel, just as Ray said. If there's many organizations that have meetings weekly, monthly, you should be participating in those. Just like I said, I could go on for days about that, but I know we're pressed for time.
Yes, and we may have some time to kind of go a little bit over, but I definitely want to get to questions and as well. But the other two things were, talking about the church on Adelaide Ave. There was a petition talking about requirement for a robust community engagement in order for that project to move forward. And someone has said, well, it should be a requirement that there's just community engagement with any project. Robust, we can need to define it, but as part of your process, it should just automatically be built in as a requirement, not a simple, a one-off, did you do that? Check the box. It's like, oh no, you have to do it. And so building in that time to do it. That was one thing that came up. Another one, to your point, Paula, was notifications. And this was something which I believe may or may not have been submitted as an ordinance, but we'll talk about expanding the notification foot from now 250 or 200 to 500 feet, maybe more. Also having the notices sent to all residents. So not just the property owners, but every resident who is occupying a dwelling, any legal dwelling or unit, they will be notified. Also, the notifications in English and Spanish, and then the notifications done in advance. So one of the things we always hear is when we did send out the notifications and I got it the day of the meeting, well, perhaps that notification should be sent at least a minimum 2 weeks in advance, perhaps a month in advance. So thinking about what you said, Raymond, to professionalism, well, if I'm ready to get this person's business, I need to give them time. That's just professional, that's courteous, it's considerate, it's thinking about that particular person. I definitely want to kind of wrap this up with this session with these 3 questions, because there were 3 things that really kind of come down to. One is relationship building. And I think someone, again, being that salesperson, being that person who worked in customer service, doing what I do right now, you know, you need to build a relationship. Assuming you're going to have one meeting, we're going to come here and, all right, we're ready to go. That is not always effective, particularly with communities of color. And Gloria, as you noted, Marta, you noted, where you have these historical legacies of oppression. It's going to take longer to develop them. So really getting down to building that relationship, and someone just said it, don't call, I said this at a meeting myself before, don't call me just when you want to talk about affordable housing for your project because it's a buzzword that you want to help with opposing something. Call me about affordable housing, but the evictions. Call me about just housing in general, if you're really genuine wanting to have that engagement. Another thing we want to talk about is building trust. You have to build trust. And building trust takes time with your markets, with those folks. So you really have to provide time to really build that trust, maintain that trust, because you know, once it's gone, then it takes a lifetime to build up. And another thing that I think is really going to be down here, and it's as we get to the next question, it's going to be key, is the word power. Sharing power, giving up power, who decides what, at when, and what time. As we really kind of think about this, it's also who makes the decision and when do they make that, how do you make that? I think we're really coming down to sharing the power of how you go about with this engagement and who makes the decision with residents. So I'm going to stop right there because we're at 10:59 and I really want to get to these questions. Like I said, we'll answer as best we can. The one that has come up was any advice on best ways to meet and engage with individual community members, given how busy everyone is, and especially given the challenges of meeting face-to-face in the COVID era. So we can ask if anyone wants to answer that right now.
Well, the Latino community, the main form of communication is la radio, the radio. In Spanish. Hit up all the Spanish language radio stations, without a doubt.
I would agree with that. And I would also say use social media, you know, flood social media. Folks spend a lot of time on social media personally and professionally. You should be flooding it on all social media platforms.
Okay. The next one we have is, are there ways for the government and community agencies to build long-term relationships within the neighborhoods and hopefully avoid sporadic outreach only on a specific project? It would be great to hear of good examples of best practices, whether from Rhode Island or other areas. Thanks for the great discussion. So I don't know if anyone, other than what we've said, or those other ways that we can repeat prior answers.
So I'll share one. One of the things that was done under a former mayoral administration, and it still exists right now, is the Providence Neighborhood Community Centers Association. This came out of the era when they were realizing that a lot of things should be neighborhood-based and should be accessible right within people's communities. So there are about still 8 or 9 of those orgs still around. We just don't know that they're PNCCA. So we're talking Washington Park Neighborhood Association. Elmwood was a part of it. Mount Hope. You have the Da Vinci Center, some of these older name institutions that have just been around for a very long time. I've always found them to be a great starting place just to get a layout on the community and what's going on in it. So I think that as we've just been discussing, that if you're intentional, if you're setting and allocating the proper time to do it, and then seeking out more than just one person, you can always engage well. I think that it's just a matter of prioritizing it. I think it's been done well in numerous occasions. I'm sure all of us can speak to a process that we thought went well. I'm sure all of us can speak to more processes that we didn't think went well. And when we break it all down and assess it, it really comes down to prioritizing. I don't think it's magic. Like I said, Dr. Feld was teaching me. She was doing this work in the 70s and 80s, and she's been saying the same thing since the 70s and 80s that I'm saying to everyone now. So it's not rocket science. It's just prioritizing it and actually valuing it as an essential part of the process for success.
And can I add to that, neighborhood associations, churches, the religious leaders, the local churches, everybody knows. They know everybody. Business associations also. Cultural centers.
And to that, I would add that, and Dwayne has touched on this point as well as others, that the engagement needs to happen sooner. I think that I think that the city needs to own engagement with the communities when projects are being proposed, and it needs to happen at the very onset of when a project is being proposed. Also, too, I would say that people in the city need to, as Ray referred, you need to get the information out to as broad a group as possible. Don't just send it to one or two people and assume that they're going to then share that information, because it doesn't always get to us in time. So I think, as we've all mentioned, we need a lot of advance notice, because all of us are volunteers in this respect.
Paul, if I could follow up on that, to the point, it's not URI's job to share about their project. It's their project. They want to come into our community. So they should be looking at your time as valuable and saying, okay, if we appreciate that Paula might send this out for us because we really need to engage, what can we do to make Paula's support of our efforts as easy as possible? What can I do in advance so that when Paula does what she does, which is get the word out to the community, I'm making it as easy as possible for Paula to do what she does well. Once again, the value. I just don't think that developers and a lot of times city government values this, which is why there's always craziness going on and why we always have to get up in arms with them.
Great. I definitely want to give more time for the other questions. So next question, as planners and governments become hip to the necessity of community engagement and buy-in, how might we as businesses, nonprofits, and concerned citizens ensure that community engagement doesn't become a means to draw attention away from sustained investment in the neighborhoods? For example, the difference between painting Black Lives Matter on a city street and actually reallocating funds into public resources.
Oof.
That's the key, right?
I actually, so, you know, if I want to kind of put on, take off this moderator hat and answer that, one of the things that SB&A did when we first came to existence and we were learning about these things is when we're talking about reallocating funds to public resources, one way is expanding the membership of boards and commissions that make the decisions of where funds and resources will go. So when we think of, particularly as we're approaching the 2022 election and we're electing that mayor, thinking about who is that mayor and those city council members who decide who gets appointed, where are their connections, who are they involved in, who's going to be a part of those decision-making bodies that decide where money goes. Because we think, oh, we talk to the mayor, we talk to this one person, but let's remember we have staff and we have good particular, you know, other folks who are involved in that process. So I definitely would say one that we identified and we still adhere to is expanding the decision-making process of people who live, work, who live and breathe the air in those neighborhoods and who reflect those neighborhoods in terms of racial and ethnic identity.
And invest in the schools, education, the youth. they're the future, and you want them to come back. There's nothing wrong with them going away and getting their degrees. Make sure that they want to come back and run for office. Open the businesses, you know, buy a home in the neighborhood, shop, stores. Young people, we need to invest in that.
Mm-hmm. The next question, which is interesting, but we'll try to answer as best as we can because we're focused on community engagement, is do you have some ideas or strategies to bring down the cost of building new housing in your neighborhoods? I don't know if anyone wants to get that, and I know we're trying to understand more if that's related to community engagement or time, but I don't know if anyone has any questions or clarity.
I'd say that more ties into the tax structure that's used in the city and people being locked in and not willing to think outside the box on how you can do certain things. I think I was aware of when I was in grad school, different locations around the country where they weren't taxing based on the value in general of the neighborhood, but of the particular property itself. And that didn't impact the property next to it. So if I did something to my property that increased its values, I would pay higher taxes on my property. But if the person next door to me couldn't afford it, it didn't impact them. They were still based on the value of their particular property. You know, nowadays, if I fix my house, your taxes go up. So you might have an issue with me fixing my house because I can't afford for you to be next to me and have a nicer looking house. I won't have a house. So it causes conflict. And then eventually, of course, if you get a few, like a development goes in at an old church that raises the value of that neighborhood, there go all the people that were in that neighborhood because they can't afford to live there anymore. So I think that there are different tax strategies that could be explored. People are just stuck in the old way of this is the way we've always done it, so it has to be done this way. And then they use the nonsense of, well, this is just a result of market forces, which is absurd. Market forces are just people's preferences, and people's preferences change. So you couldn't come here before when it was just black and brown people, but you can come here now because this developer from New York decided to do something. That's your choice. It has nothing to do with the environment or the community. That's a personal choice.
And Raymond, I'm glad that you brought that up because someone who was, when we saw the issue with the property taxes increases in different parts of the city, but had stayed the same or even decreased on the east side, which is predominantly whiter, predominantly much more wealthier, you know, there were even questions that I asked. And one of the things, being someone who was, in this full disclaimer, was asked to serve on that special commission to study a progressive tiered property tax structure. The one question I asked is, what's the appraisal process? How did you get that value? Where did you get that number from? Show me that process. So I think, you know, really getting down, like you said, to the structure, like, oh, that's just how the market is. And someone like me, I'm a marketing major. I also worked in lending. So knowing doing mortgages and lending, Gloria, you know this. Wait a minute. How do you get that value? What was the appraisal process? What did they do? So really getting down to, and as we talk about dismantling structural racism, thinking about that, it's the process that you have in place formed in a way in which it is inherently racist. So really thinking about how we've done things, even with community engagement, is it done in a way in which it's just no longer feasible? It's no longer, it's exclusionary. And do we need to change how we do stuff as opposed to, okay, how do we go about doing the outreach? And it actually leads to another question. I'm wondering about some thoughts on outreach during the COVID-19 pandemic when face-to-face and group meetings aren't possible. Again, one of the things that the South Providence Neighborhood Association going through is, well, what did you do before online and internet and meetings? You got on the phone. So do you know someone who can do a conference call? Do you know someone that you're calling in to speak with? Again, allocating more time to being able to touch more people. Do you have an allocation for mailing stuff? Maybe there are a few neighbors that you know that, can you ask them, do you mind handing out some flyers for me regarding my project? Do you mind introducing me to some of the neighbors that you know? I can talk to them, give me a few minutes at a time. So some very small strategies of relationship building that can easily build up over time to building that trust and building that community and that network that you have. I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, because I know at West Elmwood, West Elmwood does not have a large staff, but they do allocate a lot of time for those specific things. And it's not just sending email, not just social media. They actually print out flyers, little cards sometime with information on them, and they hand them out to residents. You know, you don't necessarily have to be in touch with somebody, you know, in the whole COVID thing. You don't necessarily have to, you know, be in someone's space telling them. You can like stick some flyers in the door at the property manager office. They have flyers when people come in for various reasons, things are passed out. Old fashioned ways, and like you said, calling people. Just calling people up on the phone and said, did you hear about such and such that's going on? Or this developer's trying to do this thing on such and such street. Did you hear about this? We're just reaching out. So those things happen. If an organization the size of West Elmwood with a very small staff can do that for their residents, I'm not sure why other developers and city people can't do the same thing. Because sometimes you have to revert back to the old-fashioned tried and true stuff is picking up the phone and sometimes giving people a flyer. Because, you know, especially with COVID-19, it's hard to you know, really have those in-person meetings, and there's something to be said for in-person meetings and having those conversations, but just you got to be creative, think outside the box, you know, do new ways of communicating too as well. You know, again, I strongly suggest people do social media, the other things like Twitter and all these things that, you know, especially some of the older folks, and, you know, and I was call myself that too, are just like, oh, that is such a pain. But those things work. Those things do work. People pay attention, and particularly younger people. And as Marta was saying, we need to think about that when we're giving out information. Who's our audience, and how are we sending this information out?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
One.
I think COVID has, you know, it's had its challenges, and I think like for our Elmwood Neighborhood Association, we haven't done online calls, we haven't had face-to-face meetings during this time frame. Because I think people are trying to get adjusted to the new reality. You know, some people have older parents that they're taking care of. Some people's jobs have really, you know, required, you know, more work. There's more work involved. But the one thing I would say, and to Gloria's point, is that, you know, we do have a Facebook page and we do have a website. And the traffic to both of those places has increased during this time frame.
Okay. And I'm looking at the clock here as 11:14. I want to see if we can get another one or two questions. So one question is, do folks have advice on how forming neighborhood partnerships can avoid being exploitative? And this is something we've experienced with SBNA. Back to Ray's point, a community member org that engages in the process of development is really doing a service for the developer as much as the neighborhood. How might this gift be properly honored?
I'm a fan of line items and budgets for engagement and things of that nature. I don't know. I think that you can have conversation with the orgs and individuals that you're engaging with to see what would be of value. I think maybe that's a good process to start. And then planning can put that into their general process for application. This is something that you're required to do, and we need to know how you did it and who you did it with as a part of this in order for you to be successful at it. That sounds interesting. I like that. Good question.
Yeah, and I want to say just with SBNA, in terms of exploitative, well, you know, the outreach needs to be genuine. And as I said before, you know, if you're really concerned about housing and what our work is, well, come to me to a meeting when it doesn't benefit you. Come to just listen, engage with me. Hi, how you doing? I actually just want to know what's going on. No agenda. No, I don't want nothing, because then later on when I do need something, it's not, oh, you just want something, that's why you call me. It's no, we've developed a relationship, we've developed a partnership. You've shown genuine interest in me and my community, just as you see me as an equal, just as you would with a predominantly white or a white neighborhood. If you're doing the same engagement, that's how you do it. So it's really inorganic, and it's something which you really have to change how you've done things. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and any other question that we didn't get to, we will answer. But I like this question. How are you all feeling about virtual engagement? Do you feel that it's more or less equitable than in-person meetings?
I think there are pros and cons to both, right? One advantage to the virtual meetings is I don't have to leave my home, and I feel like I can fit it into my schedule better than if I have to travel somewhere to get to a meeting. I think also too, for people who have childcare issues, that perhaps being able to participate remotely can be advantageous. But I think that, you know, in terms of virtual participation, there can be issues around, you know, internet access.
I'm glad that you brought that up, Paula, because we talk about the digital divide. That's something which we have spoken of in our neighborhood association, even in my own line of work outside of the organization. And we talk about, we're assuming that everyone has access to a computer, everyone has access to a printer, everyone's phone has the capacity, or you can download your phone, that you have the data enough to be able to view an online meeting. We can't make that assumption. So going back to, do you know your community? Do you know your audience? Do you know who it is that you're trying to outreach to you, in terms of that particular capacity to really reach people? So then perhaps you may have to do, and we as being able to discuss, we have to do both. We have to do a little bit of virtual Zoom. We're gonna have to do some sort of in-person socially distance. Maybe we limit and do a scheduling of how many people can come to a meeting. It is RSVPs, but again, in that planning, the one thing we are doing is we have to give more time. T-I-M-E, giving more time to allocate and plan and to engage and do that in a way in which we can still meet our mission of being inclusive while at the same time going on with the business at hand, giving those challenges. But again, that was something we were doing even before. We just now having to be consistent in doing it on a major consistent basis. It is 11:18, and I wonder, listening from our host at Grow Smart, if we if we have more time to go on, or if we have to finish up. I'm going to hear from them because we can go on a few more minutes.
Wayne, this is Scott Wolf. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, I would say I'd say another 5 minutes or so would be fine.
Great, great. Thank you so very much. And another question is, I went to a community engagement seminar in New Orleans last year, and a big takeaway was, if you are having a community meeting and not having food and childcare available, you didn't have a community meeting. Just curious about this group's thought on this idea.
Absolutely.
I agree.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
That's
You can't
key.
expect people to show up at a 6 o'clock meeting, 7 o'clock meeting with their children until no one to take care of their children. You're not feeding them. So if the meeting runs 2 hours, they're getting home at 8:30. Now they're, you know, they're hungry and the kids are hungry, or you can't attend the meeting because there's no childcare offered. That should be part of the planning when you're doing these community sessions. That should be in the information that goes out, that saying, you know, dinner will be served, light refreshment will be served. There will be daycare at this meeting. I think not considering that is, again, not knowing your audience, not knowing the residents that live in your neighborhood. You know, there's a lot of parents. The majority of the neighborhoods are parents. Like, let's be serious here. Like, think about that. It doesn't cost you really anything in the long term to buy a little bit of something to eat and get someone to watch the children while the parents can be truly engaged in this process.
Maybe offer some of the teenage kids who also need to do something, a stipend to be the babysitters or to the childcare.
Right.
So the whole family could come. The teenagers get paid to watch the kids, the parents get to participate, and the little ones get dinner.
I think also
They'll get dinner.
translation services are important too.
Absolutely.
And I think that might be another challenge with virtual meetings. I don't know how to translate virtual meetings. How do you do that?
Great, great. Thank you all so very much. I know, just very interesting. I would say, being from Delaware, I was told that, you know, we're Southern hospitality with Northern efficiency. And so making sure that your guests are comfortable. Is everyone fine? Everyone needs something to eat. Everyone is just great. And did we have to do? All right, let's all be comfortable. You know, let's move on where this is a conversation. It's homey, it's inviting, it's welcoming, it's inclusive.
Right.
Last question we have is, how do we conceptualize community engagement and the development of new neighborhoods and areas such as the I-195 land? And it says, like, while acknowledging the history, displacement, lack of engagement of previous urban renewal projects that may have opened up this land decades ago.
They're asking how we do it, Dwayne?
I think the question is, how do we conceptualize community engagement and in the development of new neighborhoods? So as, you know, we're thinking of a new places developing, new homes are being developed, you know, how do we acknowledge, how do we conceptualize new engagement when no one's not there yet, but they're coming?
Sure.
And I guess
I think I would say it's very similar to the process we just laid out. Who are the stakeholders? Who are the surrounding people? How much time are you taking to find who's engaged with that? If you know that there was a history of projects that didn't go well, are you reaching out to representatives from those communities to find out what didn't go well and how it impacted them? So I don't think it's anything different than what we've been saying. I think you're just applying it to a new set of circumstances.
And I'm glad that you said it, because everyone has gone back to, and I want to go back to this one. This was a question that we were asking Barbara Jordan 2 Development is, who is the market? Who are we trying to serve? So I guess the question goes back to, who do we want, or who are we trying to serve, or who do we envision being the neighbors of that neighborhood? That really is going to determine how we go about it.
Yep.
And we did answer all the questions that were submitted in the Q&A chat box. And, you know, I think it's, you know, this is very helpful. And I want to thank all of you for your time, again, for being here, to being able to explain and answer these questions, explain these strategies, given that insight. I even learned a lot more than I thought I had learned before. And I want to thank also GrowSmart for, you know, selecting this proposed panel to be here, to be on here. This is something we were going to do in person, and obviously with COVID-19, we've had to adjust to be here virtually some months later, but it's even more important now. Again, thank you, Scott, and thank you for everyone who's attended. I think we had close to 80-something participants at one time, and I'm so glad and grateful. I hope you all learned a lot. And if we weren't able to get to any questions, GrowSmart does have our contact information to reach out to us as well. And I'll turn it back on over to Scott. Thank you.
Dwayne, thank you so much. You and the panelists have done a great job. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else has. And you not only dealt with problems and challenges, but you offered a lot of good practical solutions, as well as providing a vision of how to really show respect for the community in which development is proposed, and how to value community residents and their opinions and incorporate them into a project that will be better than it would have been without that input. So a lot of food for thought. I'm glad we've recorded this session. We'll try to circulate it to a lot of key people who I think would be enlightened by this, who weren't able to participate. And I'm glad this was the most, so far, the most viewed session of the 6 we've had. Deservedly so. And I hope this is just a part of an ongoing dialogue about how to make development more equitable and more less strife-ridden, and more sustainable for everybody involved. So God bless. Thank you all. Terrific discussion. And our webinar series continues next week with a session on smart growth and climate adaptation. Be well, everybody. Keep up the great work. Thanks so much.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.